Welcome, everybody. This is the discussion portion of class number 4 in our LaRouche PAC class series on the new paradigm, which was taught last week by John Segerson with the title of The Music of Creativity. We're very happy to have John back today to answer your questions and to lead our discussion on what he presented last week. We're also very happy to be joined by 2 live audiences, one of which is in the room there with John in Manhattan, and the second of which is joining us from Houston, Texas. So welcome to both of you. Hello. And we'll be taking questions from both of our live audiences for John to address. And we'll also be taking questions from our online audience. So if you're joining us via the internet, you can email your questions into classes@larouchepac.com, or you can, and we would prefer this because we love to hear from you, you can also call into our conference line and ask your question directly. And the procedure for doing that is on the class series page. So last week, John put a lot on the table, giving us an overview, not really an overview, but a glimpse into the principles of human culture, the principles of classical culture, which included many of Lyndon LaRouche's own insights and discoveries on the issue of the human mind and music in particular. John also presented some of the scientific underpinning of classical music, which includes the work of Johannes Kepler on the harmony of the solar system, and the principles and proper tuning of the human voice. So I'm sure a lot of you have questions and things to raise to John. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to John to make some introductory remarks, and we'll go from there.
Hello. This is a more informal session than the previous one, so it's just amongst us. It's not going out all over the internet. So it can be a little bit looser than the one previously. Again, I want to start with Lyndon LaRouche and his effort to do something which is similar to what Nicholas of Cusa had to do in order to be the leading edge of the classical Florentine Renaissance in the 15th century. The 14th century, I've just been reading Barbara Tuchman's book on Through a Distant Mirror, which describes in lurid detail the absolutely horrific state that society was in the 14th century, in 1300s. Not just the Black Death, but madness, insanity. You had a king, Charles the Sixth, who was insane for most of his long reign. Completely, he had a few moments of clarity, but usually he was just completely insane. You had a head of the Roman Empire, this guy Wenceslas, who was a raving alcoholic. And at one point they tried to get together to clear away the schism between the 2 popes, because there were 2 different popes at that point. The church was completely divided. And they couldn't even talk to each other because he was in the drunken stupor and he was going crazy at the same time. So they had to separate them. That's sort of the nature of the insanity. And war was everywhere. Insane war based on outmoded ideas of warfare, namely chivalry. That is the idea of the knights in shining armor coming in with this armor that was so heavy that if they fell, they had to have the servants pick them back up again, to do it. And of course, in the famous Battle of Agincourt in 1415, which was where the French chivalry was completely defeated, it was because the rain had come down and it was so muddy that they just literally got mired and they couldn't get up, and they were completely slaughtered by the Henry V, who started using regular army forces, foot soldiers, in order to be able to win, and it included a completely different kind of warfare. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because we're in a similar impending possibility of a dark age, but then on the other hand, the the incredible possibility of something which by far outstrips the classical Renaissance. Where did Nicholas of Cusa come out of? He came out of a grouping, small grouping. It was an order called the Brethren of the Common Life. It was founded in it got going in around 1380, and Nicholas of Cusa was born in 1399. And he grew up in that, and it created a crop of intellectuals, the likes of which humanity had never seen up to that time. And it was through that educational work and that emphasis on the highest aspects of human thought that created the Renaissance, even in spite of the fact that during that time, still life was really bad, even during the period that the great classical Renaissance was going on in Florence. Other parts of Europe were totally and utterly devastated. So I wanted to just introduce Lyndon LaRouche, who's speaking here in 1973 at a series at the very first of a series of groundbreaking lectures that he gave at up there at Columbia University, entitled Beyond Psychoanalysis. But he goes quite beyond psychoanalysis in it. And I just want to show you how he starts it out.
During a period of reaction which occurred among British intellectuals in the wake of the French Revolution, there was an attempt to explain creativity in art as being something which occurred within art itself, as independent of political movements of that time. In rebuttal of this, Shelley wrote an essay, one of his several important essays, and I'll refer to another one later tonight, entitled In Defense of Poetry. And I shall read a section from the conclusion of that, which is a thesis from which we shall work to provide a setting for the purpose of this program. The literature of England, an energetic development of which has ever preceded or accompanied a great and free development of the national will, has arisen, as it were, from a new birth. In spite of the low-thoughted envy which would undervalue contemporary merit, our own will be a memorable age in intellectual achievements, and we live among such philosophers and poets as surpass beyond comparison any who have appeared since the last national struggle for civil and religious liberty. The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and receiving intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The persons in whom this power resides may often, as far as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve the power which is seated on the throne of their own soul. It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age.
Now, if you'll bear with me, next I would like to play yet another section of an address that Lyndon LaRouche gave quite a bit later. I believe it was in 1994 in Washington, D.C. to a group of music educators. I believe at Howard University. And at the beginning, and he's talking about art and music, but also science from the standpoint of educating a new generation of geniuses. He begins by mentioning the boys. And just so you know what he's talking about, it's because he had just come back from Leipzig in Germany, where he was able to visit with and listen to the great St. Thomas Cathedral Boys Choir, the Thomaner Chor, which is a chorus which in 2012 celebrated its 800th birthday. That is, it began in 1212. He was very impressed by the work that they were doing. And indeed, the Schiller Institute later on invited the St. Thomas Choir to Washington, D.C., and there was a concert there which we co-sponsored with the grouping. But that's just as by way of introduction. So back to Lynn.
The other aspect, as with the boys, which is much more important to me and is important to us in our work, is in order to perform as a musician, you must do something which makes music a powerful weapon to people who are not necessarily musicians. There's a difference between slopping something out and trying to perform it and facing problems in the performance which are real creative problem-solving problems, which you can slop through or you can actually master. I'll give an example of this from geometry, an example which I use often and the choice of example bears on the point I wish to make. My primary concern is with ideas. Now, very few people these days really could define what an idea is. Let me give you a definition, and let me relate that back to musical ideas. There's a very simple example of an idea which comes out of Egyptian history, it's actually Greek history, of a measurement or an estimated measurement of the circumference of the earth from pole to pole by Eratosthenes, a member of the Plato Academy, long after Plato had died, who went to Egypt, became the secretary or the librarian of the Alexandria Library, who was responsible for a number of important discoveries in early Greek science and mathematics. And he measured the circumference of the earth through the poles by taking two positions and using a hemispherical sundial in order to capture the angle of the sun cast by a sundial at noontime precisely at different points in Egypt, one north of the other, one in the area of Aswan, the other in Alexandria. And by comparing the angles, the difference in the angles of the sundial on that particular day, by a very simple method of geometry of similar constructions, he estimated the angle from the center of the earth formed by these 2 points on the meridian. And having people walk the distance from Aswan to Alexandria, the point in Alexandria, and knowing the length of that arc, he thus projected that to determine what would be the circumference of the earth, and came out with an estimate of a circular circumference, which is only 50 miles off approximately in terms of the diameter of the earth. The importance of this particular experiment, to me, is that he made this measurement with that degree of accuracy, with nothing more than those crude instruments, 2,200 years approximately before the first human being saw the curvature of the earth. That is, he measured something 2,200 years before anybody saw it, which is not bad. The measurement involves not
a measuring of something you can see, but measuring the error in what you see. Now, this is very much like what happens in music, of course. Some people sing the notes. Some people sing between the notes. Because the two notes don't mean anything. It's the interval that means everything. And what that interval means is everything. That in particular in the area which I'm most interested, the discovery of a method of composition or improved method of composition by Mozart, who applied an idea, a discovery by Haydn, to the later work of Bach, and developed a method called motivic thorough composition, which is a characteristic of the classical repertoire from about 1782 through the death of Brahms. This method rests upon the ability to perfect the idea of a composition so that as you prepare yourself to perform it, the idea of the composition, which exists in a kind of timeless sense, the idea of the composition begins with the first note and ends with the last note. And it's there all the time. It governs the way each note and each interval is performed. Complete concentration. And this is a perfection of that idea of music, to make a composition represent clearly and consistently and coherently a single idea. Just as an example, Aristophanes reduced the difference between 2 points on the meridian to a single idea, which is the idea of the circumference of the earth and its measurability, before anybody saw it. And that's the function, the chief general function of music for the population, is to uplift people, to bring them out of self-degradation and misery and brutality, and to give them a moment of experience in which they can approach music in the same spirit, at least approximately, that those Tamanacore children and youth sing. To attack a musical idea, to experience its precision, not slop, to perform a polyphonic work with voice transparency, so it's not mud all over the place, to learn how to place their voices in such a way that a voice part is a voice part, and not a gang movement, which you have trouble distinguishing the mezzos and the sopranos and the whatnot. It all gets mixed up somehow. But to achieve precision, to know they're doing it right, and to participate in the idea of doing it right, and know that it is right. As in the play, to reach ideas. And to do this, as you know, those of you who are musicians, it takes a lot of work to do things right. It takes a lot of training and sweat to do things right. But you find that unless you do that, you cannot actually effectively reach the audience, including those little boys and girls and others, who, if you can touch them with a perception, not of their ability to perform what you're performing for them, but their ability to understand what you're performing, and they come out of the musical events like the persons who had participated in as audience members, as it was said in a presentation of one of Schiller's tragedies. The audience went into the theater and came out of the theater better people than they had entered it. The object of a musical performance and a musical experience is to take people into the performance and have them leave it better people than they entered it. To do that requires precision. To do that requires delivering to the audience a sense of what's going on, to make the experience transparent to them, so they know what they're hearing. They have some idea of what it's all about. They can hear it done. Maybe they can't do it, but they can hear somebody do it and know human beings can do it. They can see the beauty of doing it in that way. And if they can't perform the music with their hands or with their voices, they can perform it in their minds and hear the echo, note by note and phrase by phrase, in their minds afterward. That appears to me to be the social and political and cultural and moral purpose of music. Music is the most concentrated expression, or the proper medium for the most concentrated expression of these principles in any form of art, the non-plastic arts in particular. Music incorporates the ideas, as anyone knows, of drama. It is rooted in classical poetry. It is the abstraction of drama and poetry, and expresses those kinds of ideas in a very specially concentrated way. Our job is to pick, I think, those kinds of examples that we can produce, present those examples to these people who we would wish to uplift in spirit, give those audiences a sense of what is being done so that they can more effectively intellectually participate in what's being done, and aim for the result that every child or other person who comes through that experience leaves that moment of experience, that hour or two, a better person, or a person revived in spirit relative to the person that entered the room for that performance or event. Thank you.
So now to questions. I received a number of comments and questions, even though I hadn't given specific homework assignments, that is written homework assignments, but a number of class members of the class were nice enough to set down their thoughts and questions. So I have 5 of those, which I'd like to work through now and give answer as best as I can. And then after that, then we'll have open up to questions from you and the other place. And also, I guess from the phone, are we doing on the phone too? Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So let's have the first question. I'll read it, and I think you can put it up on the screen there. Can you? Okay. Yeah. Animals love classical music, and they too have preferred composers. Our chickens particularly loved Mozart. They would stand still for the duration of a piece and just listen. The one cat loved Chopin, and the other cat preferred Liszt. The goat liked Vivaldi. On a more serious note, I saw a documentary many years ago about a psychologist who worked in a maximum security prison in Cape Town. She worked with people who had done really terrible crimes. Her method was to play classical music, especially Mozart, to them. She had such incredible success with a few people that they managed to completely heal themselves. 2 of them got their sentences cut short and became community leaders. Now, on the first aspect of animals, I think it's quite clear. I mean, there's so much about this so-called Mozart effect, but frankly, animals, to the extent of their capabilities, depending on the way they are genetically formed, they all can take on human qualities. I mean, we know that from our pets and the dogs especially. Now, the cats is another matter. Cats are sort of a little, they can get a little bit selfish, can we say? And I think that's the reason why his one cat here preferred Liszt, because Liszt was an incurable romantic, and I think he probably resonates with cats a little bit more than with dogs. But I think that it's so obvious that an agapic family relationship, just like as with children, animals will resonate with that. Even fish will resonate with that. So I think that's obvious, because they're participating in something which is higher, which is human creativity, just as we as humans participate in something higher, which is the principle of the actual principle of creativity, God, if you wish, the creator, or better to think about it as an object. It's a process of creation. It's a dynamic principle of creation, as anybody who really is seriously religious will tell you, as opposed to an idolater. On the second question, I just would point out that, yes, indeed, listening to great music is wonderful, but even better is participating in it for people who have psychological, terrible problems and social problems. And the next presenter after me is Mike Billington, and perhaps you can get him to talk about his experiences in forming a chorus at the prison where he was, and the experiences of where he had the prisoners, the Beethoven Prisoners chorus sung by prisoners, and it had a moving effect from all the people who are murderers and all sorts of people who he worked with in prison. So I think that's absolutely the case. Let's go to question 2. Okay. Is there a prescribed or more beneficial way to listen to classical music in terms of focused mindset, attention to certain things? Is there a particular aspect or aspects which one should be which one should be listening? How can one know but that they understand a piece? Optimally, what is a person supposed to gain or recognize from listening to a classical composition? I feel I understand the elements and beauty generated through classical poetry, but I have had difficulty translating this into an understanding of classical music. What am I not seeing and neglecting? Well, first of all, again, back to this question of listening. It's a question of whether you have listening. Really, to me, to listen to music really isn't the point. You're going, if you think about that, if you're just thinking about the music sort of hitting you like this, like an object, sure, but the mind should be active in working through music. That is, it's an experience, as Mr. LaRouche said, it's an experience. You are experiencing music. It's not just a listening, a passive activity that you're doing. Not only that, but, well, before I say that, one of the reasons why this particular person may be having problems is because of the terrible social damage that has been done to young people and even to older people now in terms of what you might call bad music. It's actually just bad noise. People's hearing has been spoiled, so that in many cases, people are unable to even distinguish subtleties in differences of tone of voice, for instance. So that just requires, first of all, going cold turkey on bad music, by which I don't just mean non-popular music, classical music. I mean, in general, music where you can't really identify an idea. There's a lot of music that's labeled classical, which really doesn't have ideas. It's in a so-called classical style, but if you try to listen to it, there are no ideas there. Not only that, but as I'll get through in one of the next questions, you also have the problem that many so-called classical performances nowadays of great music are absolutely terrible. And they have no ideas in them because the conductor and the orchestra and so forth has not brought any ideas into the piece. And so you're sitting there trying to listen and saying, where are the ideas? And they're just not there. And again, I'll get to that a little bit more into some detail. But in terms of poetry, I mean, here, poetry is, first of all, it's not a written form. It's a vocal form. Poetry has always been sung. And the key to music is the polyphonic vocalization of poetry, which can take poetry even to a higher level and create what you might call a multiply connected idea. Lyndon LaRouche would often describe the German Lied, or the German art song, as the Rosetta Stone for being able to get at this. That is, if you just have some idea that you can't get into this question of music, go to the German, especially the German classical Lied. There are also English versions of it, but it reached its height in Germany. And with Schubert, Beethoven, Schumann, and Brahms, and where the work, the ironies in the poetry are perfectly, not just perfectly reflected in the music, but that the music is also adding a new dimension to that. And that's the best way to get into it. I want to give a couple of examples of that. First of all, just in terms of the recitation of poetry, I'd like Megan to play video number 17, which is William Warfield reciting a wonderful poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar called When Melindy Sings. It's in English, so you don't have to worry about the language, although it is in a little bit of a dialect. And just so you know, Paul Laurence Dunbar, he was a poet in the late 19th century. He died of tuberculosis in 1906 at the age of 33. His parents were slaves and who were in Kentucky, got liberated after the Civil War, and then they moved to Dayton, Ohio, where he was most active. He was a wonderful, wonderful person, and when he died, he was truly missed by everyone. So anyway, listen to William Warfield.
Go away and quit that noise, Miss Lucy. Put that music book away. You can't stop no notes a flying like the ones that rants and rings from the kitchen to the big wood when Melindy sings. You ain't got the natural organs for to make the sound come right. You ain't got the turns and twistings for to make it sweet and light. Tell you one thing now, Miss Lucy, and I'm telling you for true. When it comes to rare right singing, ain't no easy thing to do. Easy enough for folks to holler looking at the lines and dots when there ain't no one can sense it and the tune comes in spots. But for real melodious music that just strikes your heart and clings, just you stand and listen with me when Melindy sings. Ain't you never heard Melindy? Blessed soul, take up the cross. Look here, honey, ain't you joking? Well, you don't know what you done lost. You ought to hear that gal a-wobbling. Robins, larks, and all them things hush their mouths and hides their faces when Melindy sings. Fiddling man just stops his fiddling, lays his fiddle on the shelf. Mockingbird quit trying to whistle because he's just so ashamed of himself. Folks are playing on the banjo, drops their fingers on the string. Bless your soul, forgets to move them when Melindy sings. She just spreads her mouth and hollers, come to Jesus, come to Jesus. Will you hear sinners trembling, steps and voice timid like a drawing near? Then she turns to Rock of Ages, cleft for me. Simply to the cross she clings, and you find your tears are dropping when Melindy sings. Who that says that humble praises with the master never counts? Hush your mouth, I hear that music as it rises up and mounts, floating by the hills and valleys, way above this barren sod, as it makes its way in glory to the very gates of God. Oh, it's sweeter than the music of an educated band. and it's dearer than the battle song of triumph in the land. It seems holier than evening when the solemn church bells ring, as I sit and calmly listen while Melindy sings. Towser, stop that barking, hear me? Mandy, make that child keep still. Don't you hear the echoes calling from the valley to the hill? Let me listen. I can hear it through the brush of angels' wings, soft and sweet. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, as Melindy sings.
That's poetry, and that's music. So if you, I would say that if you do have difficulty really grabbing on music per se, try reciting poetry the way Bill Warfield was doing it there, and you're getting quite close. As you can see, music, singing, voicing, it's all exactly the same. Now the next example of that, though, that I want to bring up is another piece which I also perform quite often, and I know it's one of Lyndon LaRouche's favorites, which brings up this same question of singing between the notes and really what this all means. It's a piece by Schumann. It's a setting of a poem by Heinrich Heine, and it's a tragedy about a young romantic, great artistic poet who is dealing with his rage about the fact that society is going to hell, and how he works that through. And this particular piece, and it's set from the standpoint of him being abandoned by his lover, but it's clearly his lover is not a particular woman. His lover is the entire society, the way he sees it. And this particular piece is called Ich grolle nicht, and it's part of a song cycle. But just to let me read the English here so you get the idea. It says, I bear no grudge, though my heart is breaking. Love lost forever. I bear no grudge. Though you may shine in diamond splendor, no ray penetrates the night of your heart. I've long known that. I bear no grudge, though my heart is breaking. Indeed, I saw you in my dreams and saw the night in your heart's chamber and saw the snake that devours your heart. I saw, my dear, how truly miserable you are. I bear no grudge. Now, does he bear a grudge? So it's a pretty obvious irony, and it's done. But I just want to say that if people want to get an idea of between the notes and not between the notes, I've heard a performance done something like this. I'll just be the opening of it, and hopefully, oops, piano went off. Can you hear it now? Okay. This would be one way to do it. The word is Ich grolle nicht und wenn mein Herz auch bricht, right? Ich grolle nicht und wenn das Herz auch bricht, ewig verlorenes Lieb, ewig verlorenes Lieb, etc. I'm not going to do the thing, but anyway, it's just this, bouncy. Ich grolle nicht, okay, which it doesn't give any idea of the irony that you're doing, but I've heard very, very good performers doing it that way. Now, let's hear Robert McFerrin's version. Accompanist there, in case you didn't recognize her, is Sylvia Olden Lee, who we celebrated at the Carnegie Hall concert. It's just, as you can see, everything is between the notes and the irony. If you sing any of these pieces, actually anything that you sing, if you don't sing it with a certain degree of irony, if you just sing it straight as it is, what you end up getting into is a tendency which unfortunately gained strength in the late 19th century and early 20th century called verismo, right? Where the idea is you just present life as it is and you don't present things ironically. And this became a real problem with some of the romantic composers of the late 19th century, like Mascagni, Leoncavallo, and so forth. Some people call Verdi a verismo type of opera composer, but he wasn't. It's different. It's quite different. Okay, let's get to the next question. I don't want to waste all the time. We have at least some time for. Okay, this is two different people asking related questions. The first questioner says, in the scale Mr. Sigerson was showing where the circle is 1 and the fractions form solid geometric figures in the circle was very interesting. My question is that in music, what would the circle be equivalent to? Is it representing a particular note, or is the circle in relation to music an arbitrary relation? Whatever we pick, the 1 or the circle is the whole of the sound from the object without any interference, ? I sort of get the idea there. The second questioner says, could you please explain more about the circular action of the universe? Also, please, about the asteroid belt and the harmonic frequency associated with it. I'm completely lost on that point, but I'm thrilled by the idea, even though I haven't a clue of what you mean. So, on the first question of the string, I don't want to go over this in detail in the previous class, but we had the Kepler's idea in the book 3 of his Harmony of the Worlds, where you can see there's a circle and then you have the constructible polygons inside of it. And the point here being that the circle itself, of course, keep in mind that a circle is simply a projection on a two-dimensional sphere of something, a two-dimensional plane of something higher. But if you take the circle as an idea and you unwrap it, you cut it here and you unwrap it, it becomes a string, like of a violin or a stringed instrument and so forth. And you pluck the string and then you divide it into various relations, harmonic relations to each other, mathematical harmonic relations, and you can get the various intervals. So that's pretty straightforward. On the question of circular action, I would just say that what we're talking about here is that the universe is not really consists of objects. In a discussion that just before this class was done, where Mr. LaRouche was talking about lasers, he pointed out that when it comes down to it, even the smallest little subparticles, atomic particles, really should not be thought of as particles, but rather as wavicles, that is, actions. And that indeed our whole universe is made of action rather than things. And I think that's really the point about this idea that there in the universe there's that in the simplest way you have multiply connected circular action, not just circular action, but circular action acting on itself and then acting in multiple ways. So I don't want to say too much more about that, but the fact of the matter is that it's that way of thinking about it that, for instance, allows you to have as LaRouche describes, a self-focusing laser that is able to actually use those that be in harmonic synchronization with the actual ordering of these wavicles in such a way that you can get an intensification which otherwise wouldn't be there. And this is exactly the same as the bel canto singing voice, as LaRouche makes the point, that the singing voice is able to turn the medium, that is the air through which the air through which the sound is being propagated, that the air is not just a bunch of molecules, one molecule bumping on the next, and then that one bumping on the next, and that one bumping on the next, but that what you have is that in a beautiful bel canto singing, you have the ability to turn the air into a new substance, actually created more into a crystalline subject, where you have a free amplification of the sound, free intensification of the sound. And that's uniquely done with bel canto singing. And you have the famous example of being able to sing a very loud note and have a candle here right in front of you. And if you're singing very, very well, a very focused note, it could be very loud, but if you're singing correctly, the candle will not waver at all. And it's the same kind of intensity that you can that a singer can use in order to break a wine glass. Although I must say, usually when you need to break a wine glass, the reason why you do it, it's been tried many times, and the reason why the wine glass breaks is that it will set up the harmonic, but what you need is one tiny little flaw in the wine glass. Because when you have the harmonic going like this, and many wine glasses do have a little flaw, but if you could go through a number of wine glasses and you would not get it. But if you put a little scratch in the wine glass, and then you try it, and then you find what the harmony of the wine glass is, you can break it. Anybody can do that. If you find it, just go whoo, right, really loud. You can just find the pitch, and you can do that. So now asteroid belt. Let's just take a look at the chart that I have there on Kepler's harmony of the planets, just to make that a little bit clearer. Okay. This is simply a listing of the measurements that Kepler made, with the exception of the one that I have highlighted in the middle there, of the angular velocity of each of the planets, which is measured in degrees and minutes and seconds, of each of the planets as it's at its perihelion and your aphelion. That is when it's closest and it's farthest away, because of course all the planets are elliptical orbits, as Kepler discovered uniquely. And as you can see, in most of the cases on the right-hand side, the interval there between the perihelion and the aphelion is a musical interval, which is either an octave or a third or a semitone or fifth. And I'm not going through the details, but as Gauss discovered, but it was also Kepler was concerned about, is that he could not find anything that really represented the so-called devil's interval, which is actually the angel's interval, which is the F sharp, that is that interval, right? As opposed to the fourth and the fifth, right? But this interval, which also is interesting because it's the same, it equally divides the octave form. Right? So it's quite unique, and indeed it represents the register shift of the human. It's also the register shift of the child's and the soprano's singing voice. Can we go to the next one? And here is just our wonderful description of the various 6 types of singing voices. And as you can see with the top, the soprano there, where the register shift is right at the F sharp, but only if the C there is around at or very close to C256 cycles per second. If that's raised, the whole thing shifts over and the register shift is in a different place. And this is uniquely the best situation for the human voice and also for instruments, as Norbert Breinien, who I think you heard at the class last week, was able to prove on his violin, which was one of the most acclaimed violins made by Stradivarius. It's called the Omobono Stradivarius. And he had it tested by a scientist, Bruno Barozzi, who confirmed that the violin resonated the best at this tuning. So I just wanted to point that out, and I think that deals with that idea of the asteroids and the F sharp. Okay, question number 4. So Kant started it all. In today's universities, music colleges and musicologists would cringe hearing Mr. Sigerson's report of the superiority of classical music, among others. The existentialist Ethnomusicology 101 says that all music culture are equal. An out-of-tune 2-note, 5-note scale used by a certain group of people, tribe, is the same as the European scale. European classical music may be more complex to play, to hear, but you can't claim it to be better than others. I assume that he's not arguing himself, but he's giving the ethnomusicologist's articles here. Tribal, pop music, rock, etc. It's a matter of preference, subjectivity, and so forth. I want to ask, what would be the most effective way in reaching out to people with classical music and culture's importance, where even classical musicians themselves are brainwashed into this Kantian subjectivity? Some dozens only members of the orchestra are the only people I know of that who still play classical music today. Musicians, after all, have to make a living. And on the question of classical, I just want to point out something to make it crystal clear, which that when we're talking about classical music, we are not talking about a period of music. We're not talking about the classical period of music as opposed to the Baroque period of music and the Romantic period of music and so on and so forth. As Schiller defined, classical is a mindset. It is an idea of that the nature of man is to set himself problems to solve. And I would say that in this case, that is, if you have any art form, I don't care what culture it comes from, if you have an attempt to pose not just to paint an emotion or to paint a situation, but to create an irony and then to work that through in whatever way, you've got glimmers in any culture whatsoever of great classical thinking. And I think we all need to be on the lookout for those aspects of other cultures, because as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been insisting, we have to have a real dialogue of cultures, which means exactly that, to find that which is the creative impulse, not just the traditional, various types of traditional music of other cultures. That's all well and nice, but a lot of times, as you know, what's traditional can be like the most watered down version of anything. You have to look underneath, and there's a lot more work to be done. For instance, in Chinese culture, I do not believe that we have scratched the surface, even the surface of being able to identify specifically those elements of Chinese music specifically. And I don't know Chinese poetry either, so I'm sure it probably would be easier in Chinese poetry, but I would bet that you could come close to that. But on that said, though, I would like to just point out that Bach's discovery of the well-tempered system as not just a system, but a new domain of musical action was not just a German discovery. It was a universal discovery. And I think that is the reason why other cultures take up so gladly, especially in China, for instance, take up so gladly the great classical works of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, because they sense that this is something very special. And indeed, I think that the mixture, the interaction of these cultural influences is exactly what's going to create the great classical works of the future, because we must get back to a new crop of geniuses who will make even Beethoven envious. And I just think that in all music that we have to, that you're listening to, rather than thinking about ethnic this and ethnic that, look for, as Mr. LaRouche said, look for the ideas in all of these things. If you can't find the idea, well, I mean, fine, keep looking. Okay, last question. My question is about the principle of music in between the notes. This idea or principle, I believe, is of critical importance, but I have yet to hear or be shown an example of this or how it works in the real world. I have a theory about it, but I would like to hear more about it from you. And he gives his theory. This is just a little bit of it. My theory would then be this, that it is the resolution of the irony or paradox so generated within our own minds that represents the music in between the notes. In my experience of studying great paintings, I ask myself, why did the artists include or use a specific ironical detail? And then I try to answer that why. When I believe I have successfully answered these whys, I then hear the music that was being there all along, waiting to be discovered, and was the actual reason for the painting. My questions would be, am I off base here, or can we use these musical principles to understand other areas of art and science as metaphors? And could you give some examples of these musical principles working in other arts and science? Well, I mean, the questioner is absolutely right in the direction that he's going, is that indeed the paradox in the mind is, and the resolution of that to a higher order actually is working in between the notes, and that's precisely what the artist should be attempting to do with a great musical composition, to be able to work through doing that through a presentation of a composition which is a unity, so that you get this idea also not just of a breakthrough in the piece, but also a kind of closure. It's not total closure, but it's closure that allows you then to think about going to the next level. In terms of some examples of that, let me just, first quote Lynn in just one thing. And where are we running on time here? We're at 3. Okay, we have to go until 4 or something, right? Yeah. Okay, good. We got time. This is, I don't have this on the screen. This is in a piece where he's called A Man's Original Creations. She wrote in 2005. He says, in musical performance, the principle is expressed in the relations among a polyphonic passage, in the unfolding of the performance in local intervals, expressed by what the unwitting member of the audience might view as seemingly very slight deviations, which that member mistakenly regards as like a chef's romantic personal touch of seasoning added to a standard recipe. To the witting, they are associated with a special kind of tension, which lends a sense of movement associated with what is actually the deeper meaning of the term development. As I shall explain below, this quality of tension in classical polyphony in music is associated with those classical expressions of irony, which define the ironical principle of movement in poetry and classical tragedy. The controlling influence over this subtlety, as expressed in an acceptable performance of a classical work, is unity of effect in the performance taken as an individual unit, a unity spreading seamlessly from a breath prior to the first tone to a breath after the last. There may appear to be seams in S-E-A-M-S, seams, in the literal structure of the score, but, this is emphasized, but not in the idea which must underlie the performance of that score. And I just, if you want to get a handle on that, a good thing to try to do is to compare the performances of Wilhelm Furtwängler's performing a symphony, and then compare the same symphony performed by Arturo Toscanini. You will find that Toscanini was, they were contemporaries. Toscanini, of course, was ended up in New York, the NBC Orchestra. But before that, he conducted the New York Philharmonic. He believed that you could, that the score was everything, that if you looked at the score, you could just play the score and you could get what the composer intended. It's all in the score. Furtwängler, on the other hand, completely rejected that idea. He said, no, just like a piece of poetry, you don't look at the words on the score. It's like a literalist interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. People who believe that it's the literal word, or a Bible fundamentalist who believes in the words on the page, which is phony anyway, because everybody always has an hypothesis of what the words are going to mean anyway. So, and Furtwängler was completely against this idea of just playing the notes in the score. He said, no, you have to go behind that. What is the composer's intention? And I have a little quote, just to give you a flavor of what Furtwängler thought about Toscanini. He went to many of his concerts and was concerned about this. And he said, and I think I have this on the screen. Yeah, you have this here. But thereby, and this is the reason, and he's talking about the Beethoven's performance of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica Symphony. And so you can easily go on YouTube and listen to a Furtwängler recording of this and the Toscanini and just compare it yourself. But thereby, and this is the reason why we've examined this point more closely, which for us can serve as an example for many others, since the same process and the same miscomprehension came up many more times during his performance of the symphony. He reveals how alien to him, how naively clueless he is regarding the chief requirements of actual symphonic music, the requirement of organic becoming, that every melodic, rhythmic, and harmonic creation must grow organically out of what has come before. What struck us anew in the first movement of the Eroica were his raucous, undifferentiated, elastic, energetic tutis, that is when the whole orchestra is playing, which, without any preparation, appeared next to the cantabile, singing, cantabile parts that were played with a slight awkwardness and a hint of sentimentalism. Beyond these two opposing elements, though, there was nothing. Everything that constitutes the real content of Beethoven's music, namely what is organic, how it comes from one to the other, simply does not exist for Toscanini. This also has technical causes, as we shall see later on, but at that moment we were reminded that even into his advanced age, he has never been anything but an Italian operatic Kapellmeister, one who always thinks in the forms of Italian opera music, but I would say also degenerate forms, because there are better forms of Italian opera music, like Verdi, like Mozart. I mean, Mozart wrote Italian music too. For whom the tutti on the one side and the purely homophonic aria on the other remain the fundamental concepts of music. And I would just like to end, before we do that, just in terms of Beethoven, just to read you this one beautiful description of what Furtwängler thought about Beethoven, just to give you an idea. And I think if you study him, you can see exactly what is being discussed in terms of between the notes. He says about Beethoven, there's something quite remarkable about this. Nowhere in the whole of European music is there another composer in whom the pure melodic and pure structural, the gentle and the severe, combine so perfectly in a single living natural organism. No other music in which, to use the metaphor of the human body, flesh, bone, and blood are so organically and naturally fused. The power that sweeps through this music of Beethoven is compelled by the inexorable force of a divine, rational will to obey the laws of organic life. It is an explosive music, ecstatic, extending the limits of human experience to their utmost, yet with no trace of extravagance or intemperance. And with that, I could say more, but I think what we should do is open it up for questions or comments. And also, I might ask Megan to help me out if I get into trouble here.
Okay. Well, I think we are going to go to Houston for the first question. I know they have one. So we'll go to Houston and then after that to Manhattan.
Just a moment.
Where am I supposed to go? Here. Right up here. Okay. I'm coming.
Hi, John. First, I wanted to convey an anecdote in organizing for your class. We're down here in Texas, which means it's country western music area. And I was speaking to a retired policeman about your class, and I said, this is about how the music that you listen to affects your ability to think. And he sort of half jokingly said, you mean my country western music is, destroying my brain? And I said, well, think about it this way. What would have happened to the country if George Washington had listened to country western instead of Bach? And he simply laughed because he could see the point very clearly. Now, my question is about the two sets of two notes in the Hammerklavier by Beethoven and in the Brahms Fourth Symphony, which Lynn has talked about as long as I've known him, over 40 years. And my question is, if you would discuss a little bit more how those four notes, is what you and he are saying, is that those four notes convey the idea of the piece and then it's unfolded out of that idea? And second part of the question is, how does one approach thinking about then how to unfold the idea in terms of performance so that that idea is conveyed correctly?
I wish I could play a lot of recordings of pieces, since I'm not I get nervous on the piano on this, and it would be good to play recordings to be able to show these things. The point that is important is that when you concentrate on a couple of notes, in the case of it's just those things, which is going down a third and then up a sixth, and then repeating that but a little bit down. if you're once you're able to concentrate things in this way, and this was a revolution that began with Mozart as a result of his working through the works of Bach, which he was exposed to in the early 1780s, that it creates an incredible amount of freedom to be able to get across extended ideas in a way that if you're stuck with a more of a melodic line, a longer line, it's very difficult to move. So that in the famous section of the Beethoven Opus 106, the famous Adagio sostenuto, which starts out, just so to remind you, if I can play a little bit of it. Just thing. We're talking about these first two notes. That's the way it begins, but then there's a development section, which all of a sudden he goes through, and let me see if I can try this part. I'm playing it terribly. That's the opening of it. What he creates is a mode here, which you might call a keyless mode. It's going through. It's not just going through all the keys. In a certain sense, it's condensing the entirety of Bach's well-tempered clavier, going through all of the major and the minor modes, which he does in the course of 48 individual pieces. Instead, he's doing it right in this section, which is in just a few measures. And so you're able to get a kind of a concentration there, or a musical idea lasing principle, in a way that you couldn't do otherwise with simply a melody. The other point of this is that it allows, when you have a melody, you're almost forced to have a bass accompaniment that that sometimes has to follow along and basically obey the laws of the melody. Whereas when you're getting into working with the motivic composition, that no longer is the case. You're much more free. As I mentioned on the Schubert An die Musik, which I played. All of a sudden, and on that, it's on the bass, and you're able to do that kind of thing where you're able to move the motivic idea into the bass line or into what you would call the pedal point in a way that is impossible with larger melodic elements. That's not to say that you can't have a beautiful melody, but if you break down the melodies of Beethoven, especially in his late works, you will find that almost all of them can be broken down into these individual elements, and he's actually thinking about everything is all these small motivic elements are implicit in that. I hope that answers it somewhat.
Manhattan, but first let me remind our audience participating online that you can email your questions into classes@larouchepac.com, or even better, you can call into our conference line and ask your question yourself, and you can do that by following the instructions on the class series page for this discussion. So why don't we now go to Manhattan?
Can I be heard okay? Okay.
Yep.
So I sort of gave you a sense of what my question would be a few days ago when we had a chance to briefly talk, but I've thought about it a little bit more since then. And I had a chance to listen to the recording of LaRouche discussing the idea of romanticism. And I admit that I wasn't able to, I don't think I was able to appreciate what he was saying there. And I do want to think about it more and look into more of what, you know, just some of the things he was referencing I just was not familiar with. But anyway, so I thought I would just see what you thought about some of my thoughts regarding romanticism versus classicism that have developed since I became aware that you were going to be giving this class. When I think of romanticism, I think of like Hollywood, the kind of music that will be played along with corny Hollywood movies. And so I have when I think of romanticism, I think of an idea of a sort of indulgence in, sort of a mawkish indulgence in sort of just emotions and without any sense of rigor or development or purpose. And so I was trying to think of how that applies to how that's distinct from classical forms of composition. And when you recognize that development, the concept of development is key in truly classical music, you see that, well, every musical phrase, at least you can say this initially, every musical phrase has an emotional content to it. But the question is, are you moving from one distinct concept, which might be associated with an emotion, even a very powerful emotion? Are you moving on to something? Are you moving on? Are you going to something which, yes, gives you a sense of development? Whereas, anyway, let me take a step back and introduce something else which I was thinking of, or something else which is related to this that I was thinking about, which is that in a paper that Lyndon LaRouche wrote, I think in 1975 or 74, I think it was called Beethoven for Laymen. He says in that paper that Verdi and Brahms represented a continuation of the classical tradition, but a continuation which was infected, in a certain sense, by the cultural influence of Romanticism, which was coming to predominate. And I was thinking about what he meant by that, and when I listen to Brahms and I listen to Verdi, I can see that they invoke in their music extremely powerful emotional emotions, extremely powerful at times. But they don't stay. They don't let you indulge in those emotions. They especially Brahms. I mean, they push you forward. They push you along to something which is more important than the individual emotions you might be experiencing. And so, I guess it's a challenge for composers to ask themselves, how can I make use in an important way, in an artistically legitimate way, how can I make use of these extremely powerful kinds of emotions and invoke them within my music, but without allowing my listener to romantically indulge in them? How can I use them so that something greater is fulfilled, as opposed to drawing out a musical phrase which is associated with a particular emotion, and you know, like you said, that it's about ideas as opposed to, well, if you have too much of that, if you extend that too long, these emotional sort of indulgences, then you lose the idea. And so anyway, I hope this is what I'm saying is making sense. I hope some of you can comment on what I'm bringing up. Yeah.
On Hollywood music, the difficulty here is that, and with all musical composition nowadays, you have to always think about what the intention is of the composer. And right now, I mean, for instance, I don't know if you know this, but it's sort of Hollywood music. There are some exceptions when you have sort of a theme song for something. Some of the things that John Williams writes and so forth. You know, the Jurassic Park and things like that, which have sort of identifiable theme songs. But in general, the idea of music that's written for movies, the whole purpose of it is to make sure that there's nothing really identifiable, that you couldn't actually, if you walked out of the theater, you wouldn't be able to hum the melody of it at all. You know, that is the whole idea, is that the intention is to make it indistinguishable so that it melds in with the overall emotional tone of the music in order to build up suspense or horror or anything. Well, with all of these things, the problem is also with the movie industry as well, is that they're all talking about a single emotion. The idea of having multiple conflicting, you know, emotions, getting to a higher order of things in the art, in the movie form, it can be done. It has been done in various ways, but I think that the tendency is to do exactly the opposite, to simply move to to titillate people in terms of the senses of their, to put them through all sorts of emotions of horror and, you know, whatever, but not to really, certainly not to make the person a better person as they walk out of the theater. But as I say, the idea is to make music which is really not all that distinguishable. I just want to say something about Romanticism, though, is that there are two sides of Romanticism, and you always have to keep in mind that yes, indeed, you have this Hollywood type of music and so forth, which you might call the Dionysian side, but you also have the Apollonian side as well, which means the side of very strict, a rigid following of the rules. And although that music tends to be now in the minority, in a certain sense, it's not, because if you take even a rock song or a rap song, anything like that, most of these things are, if you strip away the all the rapping and so forth, and you just look at the structure of the thing, it's completely rigid in terms of usually groups of 4 measures, group another 4 measures, group of 4 measures, with, of course, a strict beat that usually never changes, right? Throughout it's dum, 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 whatever it is, it never changes. And so that it's, in a certain sense, although it's got all this Dionysian stuff on the top, most of the rock, the so-called rock pop music and so forth is extremely restricted and extremely structured. So you've got both the Apollonian and the Dionysian in there. Is that outside or? So as opposed to Beethoven, and Furtwängler, where you're really talking about the Promethean, the idea that man can overcome these kinds of mindsets with a much higher participation in the divine, because ultimately, all music is, you might call, all great music is religious music. It may not be openly praising God, but it has that sense of participating in the divine. Without that, without that intention, you're really not going to get very far. And I think that we need a generation of composers, young composers, who are writing music, I don't care what kind, I mean, in what mode and so forth, and what style, if people want to use the various styles and so forth. The question is, if you're really involved with working through Beethoven's ideas from this standpoint, and you're committed to creating works of art that can ennoble our culture and get it out of the degradation that so many families and children are involved in, then we can get somewhere. In terms of the Brahms and Verdi, I don't think Lynn would totally agree with that at this point. I think that Verdi was, he grew up completely involved in studying Bach and studying Mozart. He actually worked with Mozart's wife, who who survived him, and he had that training, and you see the music, the classical elements of Verdi, not just in the music that he writes, but in the way he shapes the operas, by and large. In terms of Brahms, he was totally opposed in his mindset to the sentimentalism, the pure wallowing in sentimentalism of the Wagner, which is purely Dionysian music, as much as, although Lennon in his earlier years in that Beyond Psychoanalysis lectures, he did point to he referred to the fundamental emotion, and he used the example of the Tristan and Isolde opera by Wagner. But I think that in spite of that, there was no real, yes, indeed, that is, in a certain sense, it's this idea of the loss of the ego, that, but in which does occur in a certain way in the experiencing real agape. That is, you lose what you would call your little me, that little crying, simpering little person, who inside you that wants to go off and hide into a corner, and you get rid of that, and so that at a certain point that does, you will experience that as a kind of a loss of self completely. But that's not all of it, because actually what it is that you have to then go to a higher order, because unless you're Kantian, in which case Kantian would say, no, there's a wall there, you can't go into that higher order of a higher identity, of what Schiller described as the beautiful soul. And but I think it is possible to get to that aspect of being a beautiful soul, and I think Brahms was able to touch on that. And if you listen to his, especially Brahms's late works, the four serious songs, which are totally and utterly rigorously worked through, or his late clarinet sonatas, which are absolutely gorgeous, which he wrote just towards the end of his life, and his Fourth Symphony. These are totally rigorously worked through. And there's not an ounce of sentimentalism, romantic sentimental. There's passion. And I think that's the thing that is interesting, is that you get that to do anything in musical composition, it requires a tremendous amount of passion. If you don't have passion, you're not going to accomplish anything. But you have to have that passion for the truth, not for something else. So that's what I'd say for now. We can talk more about it.
Okay. So why don't we now go to Houston?
Hi, John. This is Joel. I remember reading an article 30 years ago in the 21st Century Science and Technology magazine on optical biophysics by Warren Hammerman, where he says that the DNA molecule has a resonant frequency 42 octaves above C at 256. I haven't seen much of that since. Can you say more of that connection?
You find this everywhere. And just to give you one anecdote is that when we first began to work at this pitch, which was in the 1980s, where we decided that after LaRouche, indicated that this pitch really was the correct pitch, and we convinced ourselves through the work of Kepler that indeed this was the best way to go. We looked around for how we were going to tune our choruses and our orchestras to this pitch, and that was before these little phones and electronic devices really had caught on, so we needed a tuning fork. And so we looked around for tuning forks, and that would be at that pitch, either 256 or 512, which is the next octave up there. It's 256, that's 512. We finally found these tuning forks at a medical supply store. And the reason why, we asked the doctors, well, what's this for? And they said, well, we give this to all doctors, and what they do is they found that completely empirically that if they use this to check the transmission of the bone through bone structures of the human body, that for some reason they don't even know, and I still don't know whether they've really investigated. They found that this particular pitch is the best way to do that. And I would just point out also that the best human vibrato, that is the trembling of the voice, rather than, because in a real human bel canto voice, you never, it's really almost impossible to get a completely straight, my voice is even trembling when I'm doing that. But generally, when the human voice is healthy, it goes like that. It doesn't go like a piano, which is totally straight. You know, if I do that note, I'm actually singing many notes. It's going up and down below that pitch. It's actually not even hardly ever at that pitch. It's always moving. Right? A little bit above, a little bit low. So, and if you find that the best vibrato is also related to brain waves in the human body, that are also very, very much associated with the C256. You can go on and on about these kinds of phenomena, and I think it's sort of like the golden section, which is a marker of processes that are growing. Again, I don't want to go through the golden section. Maybe Megan can talk about it, but it's the golden section, which is unique for a relationship which is defined by the pentagon, and the relationship of the chords to the sides. And you can find this that in so many processes of growth of shells and so forth, you'll see that the golden section is there. But the golden section itself is not a principle. And I think that's important vis-a-vis the question of C256 as well, is that the C256 is not a principle. It's a marker for a higher ordering, harmonic ordering of universal processes. And also, I would just say that when we started writing the music manual, this book one of the music manual that we put out, I think it came out in 1992, where there were some conflicts that we had between people who were working at it, and some people were really honing in on this C256, on the mathematics of the C256, because of course it is a power of 2 and so forth. But Lyndon was always emphatic in the way that he would pose this. He would say, no, it's at or around C256. It's a locus. It's not a particular frequency. It's an area of a band similar to the human vibrato. And the same thing with the register shift that you get. You get these bands. Because nothing in nature, as Nicholas of Cusa pointed out, nothing in nature is absolutely perfectly mathematically pure. There's no such thing as an absolutely pure, perfect circle in the physical world. It's in our minds. We can have one in our minds. But when you construct a circle, no matter what it is, or construct anything, you can, no matter how exactly you do it, you can always make it more exact. There's no limit to that. So it's the same thing with the universe that we live in. They're always what you would call, even in the orbits of the planets, they're always what you call perturbations, which is a funny word because it's actually not what it is. It's a social, the kind of the perturbations, that is the mutually interacting gravitational forces of all of the different planets. It's not just they're interacting one and one. There's a socialization process amongst the planets. They become a society or a unit, a whole, rather than simply individual parts. And that's the point that Kepler was getting at in his law of universal gravitation.
Good. So why don't we see if there is another question there in Manhattan?
You? Yeah.
I suppose this isn't really entirely a question, but John can say anything he wants about it. No, I just wanted to say, touch upon what Ian brought up, because I want to make it even clearer. One can get very confused about this matter unless one never loses sight that the word romanticism was actually introduced into Western European culture specifically, absolutely specifically, to mean based on the Roman Empire, which we've discussed. And it's very useful to keep that in mind, and based on Roman law, which was this superkantian, shibboleth, that the only way you can organize the human mind is, if you want to get things done in society, is that you do have great passions, but you better watch out and control them. You're allowed to hurl them around to a certain amount, but then when it comes down to getting anything done, the only thing that's going to enable you to get something done is by sticking to pre-established traditional rules and, never forget, popular opinion. And the classical principle, of course, was a completely different conception of the human person and of the human being than the romantic. I mean, and it was called romantic based on Roman law, to contrast it to Plato, to contrast it to the paradigm that was associated with the classical Greek. And this became adapted because of the long history of oligarchical cultish intervention against apostolic Christianity. The nation state is just one example after another in European history of these traditional, these perverse traditional movements coming through, in society and saying, we've got to get people to obey our way of looking at the world. Our power is based on that. And that's what they meant by Roman law. And so you have this anomaly once Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, and of course Mozart was murdered because he fought for this idea. Once they introduced, as part of this renaissance of the 18th century, which included the American Revolution, the symphony orchestra, the string quartet, huge breakthroughs in human practice, you did get this anomaly of these weirdos like Liszt, who were fully trained in the techniques of classical music, but mentally were romantics. And Lynn never ceases to quote this comment that Beethoven made about how the mad mad rival of Beethoven, Czerny, was ruining the young kid Liszt by recruiting him into this kind of circle. And basically the idea of these people is, look, the purpose of music is to serve the people that finance our orchestras, that finance our activity, which is the oligarchy, and to entertain them and to try to convince them that their useless, meaningless lives are anyway worth living, even though they're useless, meaningless people, that we should continue to entertain them with extravaganzas and a lot of music, and that a lot of 18th, 19th century, especially 18th century music were extravaganzas. You know, elephants walking across stages in the middle of operas and this kind of thing, which the greater composers said, no, we're not here to entertain people. We're here to help everybody, every human being, discover that they have a mind and a soul. And so these things have become confused over time. The Congress for Cultural Freedom didn't make it any better. The Congress of Cultural Freedom was just a cult to keep going, to make the lauding and the celebration of the stupidest forms of popular opinion the only form of art that anybody had access to. And so in that sense, it qualifies as a romantic movement, even though it has very little emotions associated with it. The point being that there's always great passion in life. And the passion, I think Schiller is probably the best I mean, you know, before Lynn got his hand on this, and Helga, that, you know, the way Schiller talks about the education of the emotions to be able to mobilize the passions for the purpose for which you've dedicated your life. And certainly Beethoven, he's a beautiful example of somebody who could mobilize his passions to a great degree, but the reason, the mind, the purpose was always in control. I just wanted to say that because if you lose the word romanticism today obscures what the actual history of this issue was and why that name was chosen. So we might as well just be clear about it.
I would just add that there's an overlay on the romanticism, which is that it also is overlaid on by what I was mentioned at the very beginning, which is the so-called Norman chivalry, because there was a famous book called Roman de la Rosa, the novel of the rose, which was this basically this fantasy about knights in shining armor, and which is really a funny ideal that was which was this mixture of anti-Christian ideas and Christian ideas that was sort of like the ideology of the whole Middle Ages, of the oligarchy in the whole Middle Ages, where, for instance, the ideal of that since love couldn't exist between two married people because all the marriages were arranged. I mean, it was common to be set up to have if you were, you know, a king, and this happened all the time, you had a king, and he would get, for political reasons, he would marry a 6-year-old child, you know, and so forth. So that love didn't really come into marriage. So where did you have love? Love had to be illicit. It had to be an adulterous love. And that's where you get Tristan and Isolde and so forth, which was this idea of adulterous love, which of course was completely against so-called Christian ideology. But these things were coexisting at the same time. So it was a tremendous fantasy that was of this odd mishmash of personal dignity and personal valor, which defeated all these knights in shining armor and so forth, because they were so interested in being the individual sole hero that they would, for instance, you had a war, and if you knew that the way you would do a war is you would do a flanking action where you'd have the archers over here and other people here, and then you have some other things that they would have these wars where that was advised, and these guys would say, no, that's against our honor. We are going to go first. We're going to go first. We armed knights, we're going to go right in the front. And these lowly people who are these archers, after all, they're not, you know, they're almost not human people. And, you know, they should go after us. And so, I mean, they lost horrible wars, just this just been this stupid ideology. It sort of reminds you of what Theresa May is doing right now with this stupid ideology of, yes, we're going to go out against the Russians, and so forth. It's just an insane old thing. So, and then the romanticism that was started really by Schelling in Germany was this longing for this non-existent old idea of chivalry. At that point, I mean, in the 19th century, you know, it was ultra reactionary. And this was, of course, made fun of by people like Kotzebue, who was a friend of Beethoven's, who made a lot of fun of this ultra reactionary current that set in after the defeat of Napoleon, but also the Congress of Vienna, which was, you know, if anything, worse than Napoleon in a certain way, because it just clamped down everything. And Kotzebue was making fun of these total so-called patriotic movements that were going on, but they were really neo-fascist movements that were going on. And Kotzebue, who was at the time working as a Russian emissary in Germany, was assassinated in 1819, right? And that was and Beethoven's friend, and he was assassinated for this outspokenness against these kinds of currents, and that was the excuse for the famous Carlsbad decrees, which were put down by people like Metternich, Prince Metternich of Austria, and this put down the tremendous censorship that existed through the early part of the 1820s, the 1830s, and which was the cap that was put on a lot of what was some of this greatest music. You had Beethoven writing things. You had Heine, who was writing these things like the thing that I said, Roland, these struggles to get out of this, because he knew that there was something better. Schiller was already dead. He died in 1804, yeah. And so it was, and there was tremendous censorship. For instance, you were not allowed in Germany, in many parts of Germany, to write the word freedom in a poem. It was outlawed. So tremendous. And Gauss, people like that, were affected by that. That's why Gauss was very hesitant about letting on what he really knew about his scientific breakthroughs. That why he was quiet about it, and it was only really once with Riemann later on that the sort of the cat was let out of the bottle. And of course, that's what was the predecessor. That was what allowed Einstein to make his greatest, incredible discoveries concerning special and general relativity, which maybe one of these classes will go through more detail.
Good.
What?
Yeah, I think Jason will begin to address that in class number 6. But we have come up on time. So I just ask everybody who has a question or perhaps has one even after this broadcast that we didn't get to today, email it in to classes@larouchepac.com, and we'll see if John has time to respond to some of these. And I'd just like to thank our live audience in Houston very much, our audience there in Manhattan with you, John. Next week, we'll have our 5th class, which will be taught by Mike Billington on the harmony of Confucian and Western philosophy, where Mike is going to be going into the complementary nature of the ideas of Confucius and others in Chinese civilization and the fights within Chinese civilization that should remind us of the fights that we reviewed with Dennis Small between Cusa and Hume and others. So if people are interested in beginning that already, the homework reading packet is up on the class series page, and please look for your email inboxes. We'll be sending out an email Monday with all of the relevant information. So again, thanks for joining us. Thank you very much, John. This has been really wonderful, and obviously just scratching the surface on one of the most important topics in human civilization. So thanks a lot. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you all next week.